we are getting ready to get started. Everybody step on up. We are AbuseIPDB and IPinfo. We're doing a talk today about VPNs, residential proxies, and abuse with research on data from both of our data sets. So a summary of what we're going to cover today. We're going to be understanding the role of VPNs and residential proxies in cyber abuse. This is joint research between AbuseIPDB, a cyber threat intelligence provider, and IPinfo, a high-quality IP geolocation and enrichment provider. And we're going to be talking about how VPNs and residential proxies enable real-world abuse. We're going to share exclusive dataset-driven insights on how threat actors are using residential proxies and VPNs. We're going to compare patterns of abuse and anonymity infrastructure across networks and geos. We're going to highlight where threats concentrate today. We're also going to talk about some practical countermeasures where you can use automated enrichments from both AbuseIPDB and IPinfo to actually leverage these data insights to make your network safer. So first, an introduction to AbuseIPDB. We are a crowdsourced IP-based threat intel platform validated with our honeypot network, reporter trust scoring, and ongoing moderation. We receive over 1 million abuse reports and IOCs per day from thousands of security teams and sysadmins all over the world. They receive an attack against their network. They report it in real time to our API. We aggregate all of that data and then provide it in APIs and threat feeds. And the end result of all this data that we collect is an abuse confidence score from 0 to 100% for every single IP. This score is an indicator of whether this IP is actively engaging in abusive activity based on the reports we're receiving right now. In terms of how our data is used, we provide it in real-time APIs and on-prem threat feeds. For the case of this test, we were using our on-prem threat feeds enriched with IPinfo's data. And you can find us right around the corner there after the talk. And next I have Dan here with IPinfo, who's going to be introducing what they have.
Hey everyone, great to have you here today. IPinfo is a provider of contextual IP data. So you bring an IP address to us and we tell you everything there is to know about it from a metadata perspective, all based on evidence and measurements, right? So we'll tell you IP geolocation, whether it's associated with any sort of anonymization infrastructure like VPNs and residential proxies as we're discussing today, as well as information on who's registered it, as well as a bunch of other contextual bits of information that you might want to know about an IP address that's coming into your network or that someone in your network is reaching out to. We've got a measurement platform called ProbeNet where we have today just over 1,300 servers all over the world where we run active measurements against every IP on the internet on a weekly basis, which we use to do multilateration for geolocation purposes, but also to better understand the topological relationship between IPs by running trace routes from multiple vantage points, as well as checking for markers of anonymization infrastructure, like sending VPN handshakes, scanning common ports, and that sort of thing.
So the research objectives for our joint research, we want to understand how prevalent abuse is across VPN and residential proxy infrastructure. What providers, regions, and networks have the highest concentration of both abuse and anonymity infrastructure? What types of abuse are these IPs engaging in? And most importantly, how can we actually take this information and use it to secure our properties, our platforms better? So we used 3 different data sets for this research. So first we used AbuseIPDB's Enterprise Threat Intel Feeds, which is a 60-day look-back window of all of the abuse reports that we've received across our thousands of reporters. We used several data sets from IPinfo, their VPN data set, which has a list of IPs that are known to be operating VPNs, residential proxy data set, which are residential IPs that are currently being used as proxies, and IPinfo Plus, which is their ASIN, ISP, and geographic context. Then we used a third data set, which is known botnet IPs. So this is an interesting data set that we extracted, a list of confirmed IPs that we know are associated with known DDoS botnets, and we didn't overlap with both of the other data sets. So Our methodology is that we joined IPinfo's data sets with AbuseIPDB's data sets and then layered over the known data, the known bot data set. We applied abuse thresholds to make sure that we're talking about statistically significant data, and we're analyzing the overlap between VPN, res proxy, and abusive IPs. Then we further segmented that by provider, ASIN, ISP, and geography. So I'm going to warn you guys that this is a very data-heavy presentation. We can send anybody who's interested the slides afterwards. Just send either of us an email. I'm not going to read every single table here because we don't have time, but we will cover the highlights of the findings here. So we were looking at a total of 94 million residential proxy IPs, 25 million VPN IPs, and then 2.6 million IPs that existed both in the VPN and proxy data sets. That's visualized here. So the initial findings, and we're going to go into this in more detail over the following slides, is that there is a major correlation of abusive IPs with anonymous infrastructure. So over 53% of the actively abusive IPs that we observe at AbuseIPDB are associated with either a residential proxy or a VPN. The highest concentration by far, 45%, is with residential proxy listed IPs. And to further back that up, 41% of the known botnet sample overlaps with residential proxy IPs. So what that means is, if you didn't already know this, residential proxies are bad news from a security standpoint. However, the caveat of that is that abuse is still a relatively small part of the overall proxy VPN universe. So only 3.75% of all of IPinfo's known VPN IPs were reported for abuse, and just a little over 6% of the residential proxy IPs were reported for abuse. So one of the reasons this might be is that residential proxy infrastructure has much higher churn. It exists for a shorter amount of time, so there may be more abuse that's happening on the residential proxy networks that is so fast that we don't have the time to record it. So a brief summary here, you can see also that there is definitely some statistically significant data about certain types of attacks coming from certain infrastructure. For instance, VPNs seem to be more likely to be reported for authentication or access attacks, while res proxy IPs are more likely to be associated with web app attacks or network infrastructure attacks like credential stuffing. So now to drill down a little bit more into the details of this from VPNs, res proxies, and geo, Dan's going to give us a little bit more info.
Yeah, so when it comes to VPNs, it's important to contextualize how we do detection to better understand these numbers, right? So there's two ways to detect whether VPNs are being run on infrastructure. One of them is to directly access these commercial VPN services ourselves, churn through IPs, collect the exit nodes, and report them in our data. And in those cases, we are able to associate an IP directly with the exact service that is being run on it, right? So we're going to tag not only that an IP is a VPN, but also that it's NordVPN or ExpressVPN or private internet access or what have you. However, there is also a massive number of what you could call dark VPN IPs, where we can tell that there's VPN infrastructure running on them due to evidence and measurements that we collect from our probes. Such as, for example, sending known protocol handshakes to these IPs and seeing the response that we get back, such as OpenVPN, IPsec, and other protocols. And we can know that there is VPN infrastructure running on those IPs, but it's not going to tell us who or why that's happening, right? And so that's important context for some of the data that we see here, because only 3.75% of that universe of VPNs is known to have engaged in abusive behavior per AbuseIPDB's data. But when you look at some of the actual commercial providers where we have that traceability of this IP is not only just running a VPN, but it's also associated with this known commercial provider, some of these numbers are much higher, right? I understand that it's probably difficult to read these tables from there, so I'm just going to read a couple of highlights here. 94.9% of all the ExpressVPN IPs that we have in our data set were associated with abuse in AbuseIPDB's data set. 60% for Proton VPN, 84.3% for private internet access, 14.7% for NordVPN, 29.6% for Molvad. And so you see that these very commercially accessible VPN networks are actually a quite common avenue for attackers to anonymize their IPs, to maybe pretend to be someone they're not, and that's what you see in the data here. We are not entirely sure why there is such a gap in these percentages between providers. We have a couple of working theories that we'd like to explore further, one of which is that the number of IPs per active user, that ratio might be related, because if you have multiple users or many users using the same IPs to exit through over time, the chances that any given one of those gets associated with abuse is significant. Whereas if you have a larger spread of IPs for fewer users, then even if a few of those users are malicious, they're not going to poison the well for the entire thing, so to speak. Residential proxy, on the other hand, is a whole different beast. One, because those IPs there's a much wider variety of IPs, right? So if you're just looking at commercial VPN providers, there's not, it's in the hundreds of thousands for the major ones. For residential proxy, in the last month, we collected 75 million confirmed exit nodes for residential proxies, right? And these are all through commercial services, so it's no inference, it's not based on protocols or anything, it's actual churning through IPs from these providers, and we got 75 million of them, right? So what does that tell you? It tells you that these IPs go by very fast, right? So we did some analysis on the lifetime that these IPs last in these residential proxy services. And for IPv4, they last an average of about a week. 42% of them last less than a week. 33% of them last just a single day. And the longer lived ones are much rarer, right? And so this is a very important distinction from VPNs, which are longer lived, and there's a bit more of an incentive to monitor what goes on those networks, because those providers have a bit of a tougher time, getting new IPs if those get blacklisted or if there's reputational issues. Whereas for residential proxy, that's not a concern. And as we'll see later on, there's a lot of overlap with botnets and other sorts of bad actors as well. When it comes to different residential proxy providers, the story is a little bit different than what we see on VPNs, because many of these providers share the same abuse rates of about 15 to 25%. You don't see as much of a gap when it comes to some providers having a higher percentage of abuse or a lower percentage of abuse. It seemed that there's a pretty even spread of, if it's in a residential proxy network, it's probably linked to some level of abuse. However, I think it's worth noting that we did see a couple of providers in the residential proxy space which had a much lower rate of abuse in the less than 1%. And these were providers that specifically advertised themselves as ethically sourcing these IPs. And so we've seen some validation of that in the data, because there's fewer correlations with abusive behavior. When it comes to geographic distribution of both this anonymization infrastructure as well as the patterns of abuse, the data tells us a pretty interesting story around which countries have high volumes of both anonymization infrastructure and abusive activity, but also the ones that punch well above their weight. And so we have situations here where the US with 1.6 billion IPs is also the country with the most IPs linked to abuse. But if you take that as a percentage, it's actually on the lower end of how many of those IPs are linked to abuse, right? Whereas countries like Uruguay and Vietnam, they have comparatively much fewer IP space allocated to them, but the proportion of that space that is associated with residential proxies and abusive behavior is much higher. We see here, I think an interesting example is Brazil, with about 6% of all of the IPs that are allocated to Brazil are linked to res proxy. And we actually spoke with a customer in Brazil who does net flow analysis for regional ISPs over there recently. And he told us an interesting story that this is actually a major problem for these smaller ISPs, because people will buy Android IPTV boxes and get free TV online in their homes, but those come pre-installed with residential proxy nodes, botnet, a bunch of stuff that these ISPs don't want on their network. And so they're coming to us to try and figure out, how do we detect that this is happening, so that we can let the customer know, hey, you've installed a malicious piece of hardware in your home. And so these developing markets have a lot of those challenges where there's ways economically for these bad actors to get these pieces of hardware and compromised devices into these households.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about abuse and its distribution across ISPs, which is related to the distribution across geo, and there's definitely some interesting takeaways here. So this is a list of all of the top networks where we've seen abuse over the 60-day sample that we looked at here. And one thing that stood out is that when you look at the list of ISPs that have the most residential proxies in IPinfo's data set, and when you look at the ISP that had the most abuse reports in our data set, one stands above the others, and it's VNPT Corp in Vietnam. Out of these 784,000 IPs that this ISP has, we had over 1 million reports. We were seeing a lot of web app attacks, heavy scraping coming from that ISP. And I'm not sure what is going on in Vietnam, but there's definitely something happening there. Second, you had ChinaNet Backbone and a few other Chinese ISPs. But significantly, beyond those few Asian ISPs, everything else in the top 10 was a cloud services provider. So Amazon, DigitalOcean, Google, Microsoft, Tennyson. So a lot of abuse is coming from these cloud service providers. So finally, we're going to talk about our positive control, which is known botnet IP data. And this is interesting. We gained access to 2 DDoS botnets. We're going to call them Net1 and Net2 by gaining access to their C2 servers. We got this by exploiting some connections in the seedier areas of the internet. We enumerated each net's bots by completing round-trip TCP connections with each bot node initiated from the C2. And through this process, we were able to confirm close to 17,000 unique IPs as definitively belonging to these 2 botnets. And of all of these, a total of 40% of these, I think that's actually a bit of an under, because we recalculated it, 40% in total were known to AbuseIPDB, while Net2, 70% were known to AbuseIPDB. And you can see the breakdowns of the known IPs from each of these botnets here. When we overlap that data with VPN and res proxy data, we find some very interesting takeaways. So the first is that 41% of the res proxy IPs, or of known botnet IPs, were residential proxy IPs. That's very close to the 45% of abusive data that's identified as res proxies. So the question is, are botnets purchasing res proxy access to expand their power, or are res proxies actually being supplied by botnet bots? Either way, it's interesting and not good for us from a security perspective. You can see also that there was some exposure to VPNs as well, but significantly lower than the exposure to res proxies. Finally, there is a takeaway when you look at the different res proxy providers. It is pretty evenly spread, just like the abuse was, but we also notice certain res proxy providers do not have any exposure to these botnets. And again, there are some implications that can be made from that. So, Dan will share the summary.
Yeah, just quickly, when you think about different types of anonymization infrastructure and the behavior that you can expect from them, VPNs tend to be longer lived. There tends to be more care in how they're managed to avoid getting them blacklisted, whereas res proxies churn through really quickly, and there's much less care to preserving their reputation. And you can see that in the abuse patterns as well. And I'd like to quickly just go over the compare and contrast the 2 different data sets that we worked with here. So we've got AbuseIPDB, which is behavior-based, and the flagging follows the behavior, right? So you can know exactly what type of abuse happened on a given IP, whereas for IPinfo, it's a broad contextual data set where we're going to have broader coverage irrespective of whether there was actual abusive behavior or not. You can learn about the infrastructure, and if you know what's correlated with abuse, hopefully catch some of that before it actually has the chance to be abusive, right? So hopefully we've highlighted that by using these 2 data sets together, you can actually learn a lot about early warning signals and implement that in your security routines.
So to use this data, IPinfo and AbuseIPDB both have a lot of integrations. So you can bring both IPinfo's res proxy and VPN data alongside our known bad threat intel data. And you can fill the gaps where we don't have information with their information about the context of this IP. We believe that having these two data sets together can help you enrich better, power your automations, and make your network safer. Here is a quick overview. This is the AbuseIPDB Splunk app where you can pull in all of our IP enrichment data. And you can use this alongside the IPinfo Splunk app where you can pull in all of theirs. And all of this can be run to power your automations with both of our data sets. And finally, this is a list of just some of the other joint integrations where you can use our data alongside IPinfo's data. And we hope you'll consider using this information that we shared you in your workflows. So if anybody has any questions, we'll stay here, and IPinfo's booth is downstairs. Our booth is right around the corner. Please stop by for stickers and swag. If you're interested in slides, send an email to either of us.
Yeah, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to discuss our findings, dive deeper into the data, and yeah, thank you for being here.
Thank you.